The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that day. At 28 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, but today felt different. Something in the air made his skin prickle with unease, though he couldn't explain why. Thomas stood perfectly still at his post near the palace gates, his tall black bearskin hat adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. Tourists gathered around him as they always did, snapping photos and trying to make him break his stoic expression. Children giggled as they waved at him, but Thomas remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The crowd was larger than usual that Tuesday morning. Word had spread that the Queen would be making a rare public appearance in the garden later that afternoon. Families had traveled from across the country, some camping overnight to secure the best viewing spots. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Margaret Whitmore, a middle-aged woman from Manchester, pushed through the crowd with her twin daughters, Emma and Sophie. The girls had been begging to see the palace for months, and Margaret had finally saved enough money for the train tickets and a small hotel room. This was their first time in London, and everything seemed magical to the wide-eyed 8-year-olds. "Mummy, why doesn't he move?" Emma whispered, pointing at Thomas. "He's protecting the Queen, darling," Margaret explained, pulling her daughters closer as more people pressed around them. "He has to stay very still and watch for any danger." The crowd continued to grow throughout the morning. Street vendors set up nearby, selling miniature Union Jack flags and postcards. The smell of fish and chips mixed with the exhaust fumes from the constant stream of red double-decker buses passing by. Camera clicks created a steady rhythm, punctuated by excited chatter in dozens of different languages. Thomas had learned to filter out most of the noise during his years of service, but today his senses seemed heightened. Every sound felt amplified. Every movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. His training had taught him to remain alert while appearing completely relaxed, but something deep in his gut told him to be extra vigilant. Around 11 o'clock, a man in a dark coat caught Thomas's attention. The stranger moved differently from the other tourists. While everyone else seemed to meander aimlessly, snapping photos and chatting with their companions, this man had purpose in his stride. He circled the perimeter of the crowd, his eyes scanning the area with calculated precision. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with short brown hair and unremarkable features. He wore a navy peacoat despite the warm weather, and his hands remained buried deep in his pockets. What struck Thomas as odd was how the man seemed to avoid the cameras that other tourists eagerly posed for. Whenever someone pointed a phone or camera in his general direction, he would turn away or step behind someone else. Thomas's military training kicked in automatically. Years of studying crowd behavior and threat assessment had taught him to identify potential problems before they escalated. The man's behavior wasn't necessarily threatening, but it was unusual enough to warrant attention. The mysterious figure made 3 complete circles around the crowd before positioning himself near a group of school children who had arrived on a field trip. The children were excitedly chattering about the palace, their teacher trying to keep them organized in neat lines. The man stood close enough to blend in with the group, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention from the supervising adults. Margaret and her daughters had managed to work their way closer to the front of the crowd. Emma and Sophie pressed against the barrier, their faces beaming with joy as they waved at Thomas. Despite his stoic expression, Thomas found himself fighting the urge to smile at their innocent enthusiasm. "Look, Mummy," he almost smiled. "Sophie," exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. Margaret laughed and pulled out her phone to capture the moment. As she raised the device to take a photo, something in Thomas's reflection on her phone screen made her pause. Behind them, partially obscured by the crowd, she could see the man in the dark coat reaching into his jacket. The next few seconds seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thomas's eyes remained forward, but every muscle in his body tensed. His peripheral vision had caught the same movement that Margaret's phone had revealed. The man's hand was withdrawing something from his inner jacket pocket, and the object glinted briefly in the sunlight. Other tourists continued their normal activities, completely unaware of the potential danger developing just meters away. Children laughed, cameras clicked, and the general chatter of the crowd provided a strange soundtrack to the building tension that only Thomas seemed to sense. The man's movements became more deliberate. He stepped forward, pushing past a family. With a stroller, his eyes now fixed on a specific target in the crowd. Thomas could see the man's jaw clench with determination, and whatever he had pulled from his jacket was now concealed in his right hand. Training and instinct warred within Thomas's mind. His orders were clear: maintain position and composure at all costs. Breaking protocol without absolute certainty of a threat could result in disciplinary action or even dismissal from the guard. But every fiber of his being screamed that something terrible was about to happen. The crowd pressed closer. To the barriers, everyone eager for the best possible view when the Queen appeared. The noise level increased as more people arrived, making it harder for Thomas to track the suspicious man's movements. Parents lifted small children onto their shoulders, creating a sea of bobbing heads that made surveillance even more challenging. Margaret continued trying to photograph her daughters, but something about the guard's subtle change in posture made her lower her phone. His breathing had changed almost imperceptibly, and though his face remained expressionless, there was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there moments before. The man in the dark coat was now less than 10 feet away from a group of elderly tourists who were sitting on portable chairs, waiting patiently for the royal appearance. His hand gripped whatever object he held, and his pace quickened with obvious intent. Thomas's heart pounded beneath his red tunic, but his external appearance remained perfectly controlled. Years of training had prepared him for this moment, though he had hoped it would never come. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. In seconds, he would have to make a decision that could change everything. Without warning, Thomas broke from his rigid stance and launched himself toward the crowd. His sudden movement sent shockwaves through the gathered tourists, who had been expecting him to remain motionless like a statue. Gasps and screams erupted as people scrambled to get out of the way of the charging guardsmen. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, his voice carrying across the courtyard with commanding authority. The man in the dark coat froze for a split second, his eyes widening in surprise at being spotted. In that moment of hesitation, Thomas could see exactly what the stranger held in his hand. A long, curved blade that caught the morning light like liquid silver. The weapon had been concealed against his forearm, invisible to everyone except someone trained to look for such threats. Margaret grabbed her daughters and pulled them back from the barrier, her maternal instincts overriding her curiosity. Other parents followed suit, creating a ripple effect of protective movement throughout the crowd. The joyful atmosphere transformed instantly into one of fear and confusion. The man with the knife recovered from his momentary surprise and began pushing aggressively through the crowd toward his intended target, an elderly woman in a wheelchair who sat near the front of the gathering. She appeared to be in her 70s, wearing a floral dress and pearls, completely unaware of the danger approaching her. Her adult son stood behind her wheelchair, also oblivious to the threat. Thomas vaulted over the metal barrier with surprising agility, despite his formal uniform and heavy boots. His bearskin hat fell to the ground, revealing his short-cropped, brown hair and determined expression. The crowd parted before him like water, people pressing against each other to create a path for the charging guard. "Everyone move back," Thomas commanded, his training taking over completely. The attacker realized he had lost the element of surprise and changed tactics. Instead of trying to reach his original target, he turned toward the nearest group of people, a cluster of teenagers who had been taking selfies moments before. The blade in his hand gleamed menacingly as he raised it above his head. One of the teenagers, a girl with bright pink hair, looked up from her phone just in time to see the man bearing down on them. Her scream pierced the air, causing others to turn and witness the horrifying scene unfolding. The attacker's face was twisted with rage and determination, his eyes wild with whatever madness had driven him to this moment. Thomas was still 15 feet away when the man began his downward strike toward the terrified teenagers. Time seemed to slow as the guard realized he wouldn't reach them in time to physically intervene. Without hesitation, he did the only thing he could think of. He hurled his ceremonial sword through the air like a javelin. The blade spun end over end, its polished surface creating a silver arc through the morning sky. The throw was perfect, striking the attacker's wrist just as his knife began its descent. The impact sent the weapon flying harmlessly away from its intended victims, clattering across the cobblestones and coming to rest near a tour group from Japan. The man howled in pain and fury, clutching his injured wrist against his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, but his eyes still burned with unfinished intent. He spotted his fallen knife several yards away and began stumbling toward it, pushing aside anyone who stood in his path. Thomas reached the teenagers and quickly herded them toward the palace gates where other guards were now emerging in response to the commotion. "Stay close to the wall," he instructed them, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Someone in the crowd had called for help the moment Thomas broke from his post. The sound seemed to galvanize the attacker, who made one final desperate lunge toward his fallen weapon, but Thomas was already moving to intercept him. The two men collided near the center of the courtyard, grappling with each other as hundreds of onlookers watched in stunned silence. The attacker was smaller than Thomas, but fought with the desperate strength of someone with nothing to lose. "Why?" Thomas grunted as they struggled, trying to pin the man's arms. "Why were you going to hurt these people?" The attacker's response was incoherent, a mixture of angry shouting and what sounded like rehearsed phrases about injustice and revenge. His words were slurred, suggesting possible drug use or mental instability. Whatever his motivation, it was clear that rational conversation was impossible. Margaret Whitmore found herself positioned perfectly to witness the entire struggle. Her phone was still in her hand, and almost without thinking, she began recording the confrontation. The footage would later prove crucial in understanding exactly what had happened and why Thomas had acted so decisively. Other guards arrived within moments, surrounding the struggling pair with military precision. The attacker found himself outnumbered and finally stopped fighting, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion and defeat. Thomas stepped back, his formal red tunic torn and dirty from the struggle, but his expression remained professional. The crowd had moved back to create a wide circle around the scene, but nobody had left. Instead, hundreds of people stood in shocked silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Many held their phones aloft, capturing every moment of the aftermath. Police officers in high-visibility vests pushed through the crowd, their boots echoing against the cobblestones. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing the scene and beginning their preliminary investigation. The attacker was quickly handcuffed and searched, revealing no additional weapons but several handwritten notes that appeared to contain rambling threats. Thomas stood at attention as his commanding officer approached, ready to explain his actions and accept whatever consequences might follow. Breaking protocol was a serious matter in the Queen's Guard, regardless of the circumstances. His career and reputation now hung in the balance, dependent on whether his split-second decision would be viewed as heroic or insubordinate. The elderly woman in the wheelchair, who had been the attacker's original target, was finally made aware of how close she had come to serious harm. Her son helped her understand what had happened, and she looked toward Thomas with tears in her eyes, mouthing the words "thank you" across the courtyard. Emergency medical personnel arrived to treat the attacker's injured wrist and assess him for drug use or mental health issues. The man had become docile once restrained, sitting quietly on the ground with his head down, seemingly unaware of the chaos he had created. As the immediate crisis passed, the crowd began to murmur among themselves, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. The planned royal appearance had been quietly canceled, but nobody seemed to mind. They had witnessed something far more dramatic than a formal ceremony. They had seen a real hero in action. The crowd's initial shock began to transform into something else entirely. Instead of fear, murmurs of confusion rippled through the gathering as people tried to understand why Thomas had acted so dramatically. From their perspective, a perfectly normal morning had suddenly erupted into chaos when the guard abandoned his post and attacked an innocent tourist. "What just happened?" asked a man from Birmingham, looking around at the other confused faces. "That guard just went mad and started chasing people." Margaret Whitmore stared at her phone screen, reviewing the footage she had captured. The video clearly showed the attacker's knife, but she realized that most people in the crowd had been too far away or at the wrong angle to see the weapon. To them, it must have looked like Thomas had simply lost his mind and assaulted a random visitor. "Mummy, why did the soldier hurt that man?" Emma asked, tugging on Margaret's coat sleeve. Margaret struggled to explain what she wasn't entirely sure she understood herself. The events had unfolded so quickly that even she, who had witnessed most of it firsthand, found it difficult to piece together the complete sequence. A group of teenagers near the back of the crowd had begun filming with their phones, but they had missed the crucial moments when the knife was visible. Their videos would only show Thomas breaking protocol and tackling what appeared to be an unarmed man. Social media posts were already beginning to appear, with hashtags questioning the guard's mental state and calling for an investigation. Detective. Inspector Sarah Chen arrived on scene within minutes of the police response. She was a veteran investigator with over 15 years of experience, known for her ability to quickly assess complex situations. As she surveyed the scene, she immediately recognized that this incident was far more complicated than it initially appeared. "I need everyone to step back and give us some room," she announced to the crowd. "We're going to need to speak with witnesses, so please don't leave the area just yet." Thomas remained standing at attention, his training preventing him from explaining his actions until properly questioned by his superiors. His commanding officer, Major William Harrison, had arrived and was speaking in hushed tones with the detective inspector. The major's expression was grave as he glanced between Thomas and the restrained attacker. The crowd's mood continued to shift as more people shared their perspectives on what they thought they had witnessed. Some defended Thomas, arguing that he must have had good reason to act. Others were more critical, suggesting that the guard had used excessive force against someone who might have been mentally ill or confused. "He could have killed that poor man," complained an elderly gentleman from Wales. "Guards aren't supposed to attack tourists. What's this world coming to?" A woman from London disagreed sharply. "You don't know what you're talking about. That guard saved lives today. I saw the whole thing from the beginning, but when pressed for details, even the most confident witnesses found their accounts differing significantly. The chaos and speed of events had made it nearly impossible for anyone to see everything clearly. Most people had only fragments of the story, leading to wildly different interpretations of Thomas's actions." Margaret approached Detective Inspector Chen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Excuse me, officer," she said nervously. "I think I have video footage that might help explain what really happened." The detective's eyes lit up with interest. Video evidence could be the key to understanding this puzzling incident. She carefully took Margaret's phone and began reviewing the footage, her expression growing more serious with each passing second. "This is extremely helpful," she told Margaret. "I'm going to need to take a formal statement from you, and we'll need to preserve this video as evidence." Meanwhile, the attacker sat quietly in the back of an ambulance while paramedics treated his injured wrist. He had given his name as David Palmer, age 34, from Manchester. When questioned about his motives, his responses were disjointed and strange, filled with references to imagined slights and perceived injustices. "They all deserve it," he mumbled to the paramedic. "Every single one of them. The old woman was just the beginning." The paramedic, trained to remain neutral in such situations, carefully documented Palmer's statements while providing medical care. These words would later prove crucial in understanding the scope of the tragedy that Thomas had prevented. Other guards who had witnessed the incident were being questioned separately. Sergeant Robert Davies, who had been stationed at the adjacent post, provided a different perspective on the events. "Thomas's behavior was completely out of character," he explained to Major Harrison. "In 6 years of service, I've never seen him break protocol for anything. He wouldn't have done this without serious cause." The investigation was complicated by the fact that Thomas himself couldn't immediately explain his actions. Military protocol required him to remain silent until formally debriefed by his commanding officer. This silence only fueled more speculation among the crowd about his mental state. Dr. Emily Foster, a psychiatrist who had been visiting the palace with her family, volunteered her professional opinion to Detective Inspector Chen. She had observed Palmer's behavior before the incident and noticed several concerning signs, That man was displaying classic pre-attack indicators, she explained. His posture, his movement patterns, the way he was scanning the crowd, these are behaviors we see in individuals preparing to commit violence. Her testimony provided crucial professional insight, but it still didn't fully explain how Thomas had recognized the threat so quickly. Most trained security professionals would have missed the subtle signs that had triggered the guard's response. The crowd began to thin as some people left to catch buses or trains, but many others remained, drawn by curiosity about the outcome of the investigation. Street vendors continued to work nearby, though their cheerful calls seemed inappropriate given the serious nature of what had occurred. News vans began arriving as word of the incident spread through London's media networks. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to share their version of events, creating a cacophony of conflicting accounts that would dominate the evening news. Thomas finally received permission to provide his initial statement to Major Harrison. His account was clear and precise, detailing every observation that had led to his decision to act. He described Palmer's unusual behavior, the concealed weapon, and his assessment of the imminent threat to innocent people. "I understand that. I broke protocol, sir," Thomas concluded. "I accept full responsibility for my actions and any consequences that may result." Major Harrison studied the young guard's face, looking for any signs of instability or fabrication. What he saw was a dedicated soldier who had made a split-second decision based on his training and instincts. The major's own experience in combat zones told him that Thomas was telling the truth. The investigation would continue for hours, but already the pieces of a disturbing picture were beginning to emerge. David Palmer's notebook contained detailed plans for multiple attacks, targeting what he called soft civilian gatherings. The elderly woman in the wheelchair had been chosen at random, simply because she appeared vulnerable and defenseless. As the afternoon wore on, more evidence supported Thomas's version of events. Security cameras from nearby buildings had captured different angles of the incident, and experts were analyzing the footage frame by frame. The knife, recovered from the cobblestones, bore Palmer's fingerprints and traces of a sharpening compound, suggesting premeditation. Yet despite the mounting evidence in Thomas's favor, public opinion remained divided. The complexity of the situation made it difficult for casual observers to understand the split-second decisions that had prevented what could have been a mass casualty event. 3 hours after the incident, Detective Inspector Chen gathered the key witnesses in a private room within the palace security office. The atmosphere was tense as she prepared to present her preliminary findings. Thomas sat rigidly in his chair, still wearing his torn and dirty red tunic, while Major Harrison observed from the corner of the room. Margaret Whitmore's video footage had been enhanced by the police technical unit, revealing details that weren't visible to the naked eye during the original incident. Frame-by-frame analysis showed the exact moment when David Palmer had withdrawn the knife from his jacket, and the calculated way he had approached his intended victims. "Ladies and gentlemen," Detective Inspector Chen began, "we now have a clearer picture of what occurred this morning. Mr. Palmer was carrying a military-grade combat knife with a 6-inch serrated blade. His notebook contains detailed plans for what he called Operation Cleansing, targeting multiple locations across London." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What had appeared to be an overreaction by an unstable guard was actually a precisely timed intervention that had prevented a potential massacre. Dr. Foster, who had remained to assist with the investigation, provided additional context about Palmer's mental state. "My preliminary assessment suggests Mr. Palmer was experiencing a psychotic episode combined with deeply held paranoid delusions. His writings indicate months of planning and preparation for these attacks." Thomas listened to these revelations with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that his actions were being vindicated, but horror at learning how close innocent people had come to serious harm or death. The elderly woman in the wheelchair had been completely unaware that she was seconds away from becoming the first victim in a planned series of attacks. Major Harrison stepped forward to address the room. "Guard Mitchell's actions this morning were exemplary. His training and instincts identified a threat that others missed, and his quick response undoubtedly saved multiple lives. There will be no disciplinary action taken against him." Outside the security office, the crowd had largely dispersed, but media attention was intensifying. News crews had set up satellite trucks along the street, and reporters were providing live updates to television audiences across the country. The story was evolving rapidly as more details emerged about Palmer's background and intentions. Social media continued to buzz with conflicting interpretations of the event. Early posts criticizing Thomas's actions were being challenged by new information, but the damage to public perception was already significant. Hashtags calling for his dismissal competed with others praising him as a hero. Palmer himself remained in custody at a secure medical facility where psychiatrists were conducting comprehensive evaluations. His rambling statements revealed a deep-seated hatred for what he perceived as societal decay, and his notebook contained detailed surveillance notes about various public locations around London. He had been watching the palace for weeks, Detective Inspector Chen explained to the assembled group. His notes described the daily routines of the guards, the patterns of crowd gatherings, and optimal times for maximum casualties. The investigation revealed that Palmer had no previous criminal record, but had recently lost his job and gone through a bitter divorce. Friends and family members described a gradual change in his personality over the past year, with increasing isolation and paranoid statements about government conspiracies and social injustice. Thomas was finally allowed to return to his quarters to clean up and change clothes. As he walked through the palace corridors, other guards he encountered didn't know quite how to react. Word of his actions had spread quickly through the ranks, creating a mixture of admiration and concern about the precedent his protocol breach might set. In his small private room, Thomas sat on his narrow bed and tried to process the events of the day. His military training had prepared him for combat situations, but nothing had prepared him for the surreal experience of being simultaneously praised and criticized for the same action. His phone buzzed with messages from family and friends who had seen news reports about the incident. His mother in Yorkshire had called 6 times, desperate for reassurance that her son was safe and hadn't suffered a mental breakdown. His younger sister sent a text message that simply read, "Proud of you, big brother." Meanwhile, Margaret Whitmore was giving a detailed statement to Detective Inspector Chen, describing everything she had observed from her unique vantage point in the crowd. Her daughters, Emma and Sophie, had been temporarily moved to a family room where they could play while their mother assisted with the investigation. "I saw the man acting strangely from the beginning," Margaret explained. "He wasn't taking pictures or chatting with anyone like the other tourists. He kept circling around, watching people, especially the older visitors and families with children." Her testimony provided crucial context about Palmer's pre-attack behavior that helped investigators understand his target selection process. The man had spent nearly an hour evaluating potential victims before settling on the elderly woman in the wheelchair. The teenagers who had been Palmer's secondary targets were also providing statements, though their accounts were fragmented due to shock and the speed of events. The girl with pink hair whose scream had alerted others to the danger was still visibly shaken hours after the incident. "I looked up from my phone and saw this man running toward us with something shiny in his hand," she told investigators. "Then the guard appeared out of nowhere and threw his sword like something from a movie. It was terrifying but also amazing." As the afternoon progressed, additional security camera footage emerged from nearby buildings and tourist buses. These multiple angles provided investigators with a comprehensive view of the incident, confirming every detail of Thomas's account and revealing several aspects of Palmer's behavior that even the most observant witnesses had missed. The knife that Thomas had knocked from Palmer's hand was sent for forensic analysis. Investigators discovered that it had been recently sharpened to a razor edge, and traces of metal filings in Palmer's coat pocket suggested he had been preparing the weapon specifically for the attack. Dr. Foster completed her preliminary psychiatric evaluation of Palmer and briefed the investigation team on her findings. Mr. Palmer exhibits classic symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia combined with antisocial personality traits. His delusions have created a worldview where violence against innocent people is not only justified, but necessary. The psychiatrist's report painted a disturbing picture of a man who had spent months planning multiple attacks across London. The palace incident was intended to be just the beginning of what Palmer had envisioned as a campaign to wake people up to what he perceived as societal problems. His notebook contains detailed plans for attacks at shopping centers, schools, and public transportation hubs, Dr. Foster explained. Each location was chosen for maximum civilian casualties and media impact. As evening approached, Detective Inspector Chen prepared to hold a press conference to address the growing media attention and public speculation about the incident. The facts of the case were now clear, but she knew that changing public perception would be much more challenging. Thomas received word that he would be required to appear at the press conference to answer questions about his actions. The prospect of facing dozens of reporters and cameras filled him with dread, but he understood that public accountability was part of his duty as a member of the Queen's Guard. The press conference was scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening, giving investigators time to complete their initial analysis and prepare a comprehensive statement about the incident. The goal was to provide accurate information that would counteract the speculation and misinformation that had been circulating on social media throughout the day. As Thomas prepared for what would likely be one of the most difficult experiences of his career, he reflected on the split-second decision that had changed everything. In that moment when he saw Palmer reaching for the knife, he had no time to consider consequences or protocols. He had simply acted on instinct and training to protect innocent people from harm. Now, hours later, as the full scope of the prevented tragedy became clear, Thomas began to understand that his actions had implications far beyond a single day's duty. He had not only saved lives, but had also highlighted the constant vigilance required to protect public safety in an increasingly unpredictable world. The press conference room at Scotland Yard buzzed with anticipation as reporters from across the United Kingdom and international media outlets took their seats. Camera crews adjusted their equipment, while journalists reviewed their notes and prepared questions. The story had captured public attention in a way that few incidents involving the Royal Guard ever had. Detective Inspector Chen entered the room at precisely 7 o'clock, followed by Major Harrison and Thomas. The young guard had changed into a fresh, perfectly pressed uniform, but the tension in his face was unmistakable. He had never spoken to the media before, and the prospect of facing dozens of experienced reporters was daunting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Detective Inspector Chen began, "I want to provide you with accurate information about this morning's incident at Buckingham Palace, as there has been considerable speculation and misinformation circulating throughout the day." She outlined the basic facts of the case, explaining how the investigation had revealed David Palmer's elaborate plan for multiple attacks across London. The combat knife, the detailed notebooks, and the psychiatric evaluation all painted a picture of a man who had been preparing for weeks to commit acts of mass violence. Guard Thomas Mitchell's actions this morning prevented what could have been a tragedy of significant proportions, she continued. His training and situational awareness allowed him to identify a threat that others missed and respond appropriately to protect innocent civilians. The first question came from a reporter with the BBC. "Detective Inspector, why wasn't this threat identified earlier? Shouldn't security measures have prevented someone like Mr. Palmer from getting so close to potential victims?" Chen acknowledged the challenge of identifying individuals who had no previous criminal record or obvious warning signs. Mr. Palmer appeared to be an ordinary tourist. He had no weapons visible, no suspicious behavior that would have triggered standard security protocols. It was only Guard Mitchell's exceptional observational skills that detected the subtle indicators of his intent. A journalist from the Times raised her hand. "Can you explain exactly what Guard Mitchell observed that made him break protocol? This seems like an extraordinary breach of normal procedures." Major Harrison stepped forward to answer this question. Guard Mitchell noticed several behavioral anomalies that, when combined, suggested a potential threat. The suspect's movement patterns, his avoidance of cameras, and his focused attention on vulnerable targets all indicated possible hostile intent. Thomas was then asked to describe his thought process during those crucial moments. Speaking slowly and carefully, he explained how years of training had taught him to recognize pre-attack indicators. "I observed the subject conducting what appeared to be surveillance of the crowd," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. His behavior was inconsistent with normal tourist patterns. When I saw him reach into his jacket while approaching the elderly lady, I had seconds to make a decision. The room fell silent as Thomas described the split-second choice between following protocol and taking action to protect lives. His account was clear and professional, but the weight of that decision was evident in his voice. Margaret Whitmore had also been invited to the press conference as a key witness. Her video footage had been crucial in establishing the timeline of events and proving the existence of the weapon that most observers had missed. I was trying to take pictures of my daughters when I noticed something in the reflection on my phone screen, she explained to the assembled media. The man behind us was pulling something from his jacket and it caught the light. I couldn't see clearly what it was at the time, but the guard obviously saw it better than I did. Her testimony provided civilian perspective that helped humanize the incident beyond the official law enforcement and military accounts. She described the terror and confusion in the crowd, but also the gradual realization that something far more serious had been prevented. A reporter from Sky News asked about the criticism Thomas had faced on social media throughout the day. Guard Mitchell, how do you respond to people who have suggested that your actions were excessive or that you should have found another way to handle the situation? Thomas considered the question carefully before responding. I understand that my actions appeared extreme to those who couldn't see the weapon or understand the immediacy of the threat. If I had to make the same decision again, with the same information and the same time constraints, I would act exactly the same way. His answer was straightforward and unapologetic, reflecting both his confidence in his decision and his acceptance of the controversy it had created. Dr. Foster was asked to provide professional insight into Palmer's mental state and the likelihood of his attack plans succeeding. Based on my evaluation, Mr. Palmer had progressed beyond ideation into active planning and preparation. His notebook contained detailed information about multiple targets, suggesting that today's prevented attack would have been followed by others. The psychiatrist's testimony added weight to the argument that Thomas's actions had prevented not just one incident, but potentially a series of attacks that could have resulted in numerous casualties across London. Questions continued for over an hour, covering every aspect of the incident from multiple perspectives. The media was particularly interested in the split between public perception and the reality of what had occurred, as social media continued to show divided opinions about Thomas's actions. A journalist from The Guardian asked about the broader implications for public safety and security protocols. Does this incident suggest that current security measures are inadequate? Should we expect to see changes in how public gatherings are protected? Detective Inspector Chen acknowledged that the incident would likely prompt reviews of existing security procedures, but emphasized that no system could be perfect when dealing with individuals who had no previous indicators of violent intent. The reality is that we rely heavily on the training and judgment of security personnel to identify threats that our systems might miss, she explained. In this case, that human element proved crucial in preventing a tragedy. As the press conference wound down, Thomas was asked about his personal feelings regarding the day's events. For the first time during the session, his professional composure showed signs of strain. I became a Queen's Guard to protect people, he said quietly. When I saw that knife being drawn toward innocent civilians, including children, there was no choice to make. My duty was clear, regardless of the personal consequences I might face. His words carried the weight of genuine conviction, and even the most skeptical reporters in the room seemed moved by his sincerity. The young guard had not sought glory or recognition. He had simply done what his training and conscience demanded in a moment of crisis. The final question came from a local London reporter who asked about Thomas's future with the Queen's Guard. Major Harrison answered definitively, "Guard Mitchell will continue his service with our full confidence and support. His actions today exemplify the highest standards of the Queen's Guard and the British military." As the press conference concluded, the assembled media began to file out, many already preparing stories that would dramatically shift public perception of the morning's events. The narrative was changing from one of a guard's inexplicable breakdown to one of heroic intervention that had saved innocent lives. Thomas remained seated for a moment after the cameras stopped rolling, the enormity of the day finally beginning to sink in. He had gone from being an anonymous ceremonial guard to a public figure whose split-second decision would be analyzed and debated for months to come. Detective Inspector Chen approached him as the room emptied. "You should know that Mr. Palmer's notebook contained specific references to timing his attack when the crowds were largest. Your intervention likely saved dozens of lives, not just the immediate targets." The weight of this revelation settled on Thomas's shoulders like a physical burden. He had prevented not just one assault, but potentially the first in a series of coordinated attacks that could have terrorized London for weeks. Margaret Whitmore and her daughters were escorted back to their hotel, their planned day of sightseeing having turned into something none of them would ever forget. Emma and Sophie still didn't fully understand what had happened, but they sensed the seriousness of the events they had witnessed. "Mummy, is the soldier a hero?" Emma asked as they walked through the hotel lobby. Margaret looked down at her daughter and smiled for the first time since the morning's chaos. "Yes, sweetheart. He's definitely a hero." The story dominated evening news broadcasts across the country, with the press conference footage providing clear, authoritative information that helped counter the speculation and misinformation that had spread throughout the day. Public opinion began to shift as people understood the true nature of the threat that had been prevented. Social media platforms saw a dramatic reversal in sentiment, with hashtags supporting Thomas trending nationwide. Videos of the press conference were shared thousands of times, particularly his explanation of the split-second decision that had defined his day. Palmer remained in secure custody, undergoing comprehensive psychiatric evaluation and facing multiple, serious charges. His notebook had revealed not just plans. 6 months after the incident, Thomas Mitchell stood once again at his familiar post outside Buckingham Palace. The tourists gathered around him much as they always had, taking photos and trying to make him smile. But something fundamental had changed. The crowd looked at him differently now, with a mixture of recognition and respect that went beyond his ceremonial role. A small plaque had been installed near his usual position, commemorating the prevention of what investigators had later confirmed would have been one of the deadliest civilian attacks in London's recent history. Palmer's notebook had revealed plans for 7 separate incidents across the city, each designed to maximize casualties and create widespread panic. The elderly woman whose life Thomas had saved, Mrs. Eleanor Hartford, had become something of a celebrity herself. At 73 years old, she had spent the months since the incident traveling around the country, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of vigilance and the courage of ordinary people who choose to act in extraordinary circumstances. She made a point of visiting the palace once a month, always making sure to thank Thomas personally for his actions. Their brief conversations had become a highlight of his service, reminding him of the human cost that his split-second decision had prevented. "Young man," she would always say with a warm smile, "you gave me 6 more months with my grandchildren that I wouldn't have had otherwise. That's a gift I can never repay." Margaret Whitmore and her daughters had also become regular visitors to London, no longer just tourists, but part of an extended community connected by the shared experience of that dramatic morning. Emma and Sophie, now 9 years old, had written Thomas thank you letters in their school's best handwriting, decorating them with drawings of palace guards and British flags. The video footage Margaret had captured had been analyzed by security experts around the world, becoming a training tool for law enforcement and military personnel. Her unique perspective had provided crucial evidence, but more importantly, it had helped shift public perception from criticism to understanding of Thomas's actions. David Palmer had been sentenced to life imprisonment after pleading guilty to attempted murder and conspiracy to commit terrorist acts. The psychiatric evaluations had revealed the full scope of his planned campaign, confirming that Thomas's intervention had prevented not just one attack, but potentially dozens of casualties across multiple incidents. Dr. Foster had continued to work with investigators, helping them understand how Palmer's mental illness had developed into such a detailed and dangerous plan. Her research into pre-attack indicators had been influenced by Thomas's observations, leading to improved training programs for security personnel worldwide. The case had sparked a broader conversation about mental health resources and the importance of early intervention before individuals reached the point of planning violence. Palmer's deterioration had been gradual and largely invisible to those around him, highlighting the challenges of identifying potential threats before they acted. Thomas himself had been promoted to lance corporal and had begun training other guards in threat recognition and rapid response techniques. His experience had become part of the official curriculum, though he remained humble about his role in preventing the tragedy. Anyone with proper training would have done the same thing, he insisted whenever asked about his actions. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right preparation. But his colleagues knew better. The combination of observational skills, quick thinking, and courage required to act as Thomas had was rare, even among highly trained military personnel. His actions had set a new standard for vigilance and response that influenced security protocols far beyond the Queen's Guard. The teenagers who had been Palmer's secondary targets had stayed in touch with Thomas through social media, sending him updates about their lives and studies. The girl with pink hair, whose scream had alerted others to the danger, had decided to pursue a career in law enforcement, inspired by witnessing the difference that quick thinking and courage could make. Major Harrison had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, partly in recognition of his handling of the incident and its aftermath. He had defended Thomas's actions from the beginning, understanding instinctively that the young guard's decision had been correct, despite the apparent breach of protocol. Protocol exists to guide decision-making in normal circumstances, he had explained to visiting officials from other military units. But extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary judgment, and Guard Mitchell demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative we want to see in our personnel. The incident had also led to changes in how the Queen's Guard interacted with the public. While maintaining their traditional stoic demeanor, guards were now encouraged to be more actively observant of crowd behavior, and were given clearer authorization to act independently when they identified immediate threats. Thomas's story had been featured in military journals and security publications around the world. Though he remained uncomfortable with the attention, he preferred to focus on his daily duties rather than his moment of fame, understanding that true security came from consistent vigilance rather than dramatic gestures. The palace gardens where the Queen had originally planned to make her appearance that day had been redesigned with improved security features, though the changes were subtle enough to maintain the location's historic character. The incident had reminded everyone involved that even the most secure locations required human judgment to identify and respond to emerging threats. Detective Inspector Chen had been promoted to Chief Inspector, her handling of the investigation, having impressed her superiors with its thoroughness and sensitivity to public concerns. She often used the case as an example in training sessions, emphasizing the importance of preserving evidence and managing public perception during high-profile incidents. As the anniversary of the incident approached, media outlets began planning retrospective pieces about the prevented attack and its lasting impact on security procedures. Thomas had declined most interview requests, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves rather than becoming a public figure. The Crown Jewelers had created a special commendation medal for Thomas, recognizing his service beyond the call of duty. The ceremony was private, attended only by his family and closest colleagues, reflecting his preference for quiet recognition rather than public celebration. Mrs. Hartford had been invited to present the medal, a gesture that brought the story full circle. As she pinned the decoration to Thomas's uniform, she whispered, "Thank you for giving me the chance to see my great-grandchildren grow up." The simple words carried more weight than any official recognition or media coverage could provide. They reminded Thomas of why he had chosen to serve, and why his split-second decision had been so important to the lives of real people with families, dreams, and futures that had been preserved by his actions. Standing at his post that day, Thomas reflected on how one moment had changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone who had been in that crowd 6 months earlier. The elderly woman reading to her grandchildren, the teenagers pursuing their education, the families visiting London for the first time. All of them continued their lives because of a decision that had taken less than a second to make but would resonate for years to come. The tourists continued to gather around him, taking their photos and marveling at his stillness, unaware that they were in the presence of someone who had prevented one of the deadliest attacks in London's history. For Thomas, this anonymity was perfect. He had never sought recognition for doing his duty, and he was content to return to the quiet vigilance that was the true heart of his service. As the sun set over the palace grounds, Thomas remained at his post, watching over the crowd with the same careful attention that had made the difference on that dramatic morning. His story had become part of the palace's history, but for him, it was simply another day of serving and protecting the people, who trusted him to keep them safe